This is Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. I'm your host, Monica Hadley, and with me is my co-host and mom, Caroline Kilburn.
And I don't have much voice today, so
that's right.
For some reason, it just disappeared.
Well, there's a lot of
that going around.
Yeah, a lot of that going around. The creepy crawly crud.
That's right. That's what I call it too.
So this is Writers' Voices, and our guest today is author Pam Jenoff. She's the author of The Commandant's Girl, which was an international bestseller and nominated for a Quill Award, as well as 7 other novels. She holds a bachelor's degree in international affairs from George Washington University and a master's degree in history from Cambridge. And she received her JD from the University of Pennsylvania. And she looks like she must have started all of this when she was about 5.
That's right.
Jenoff's novels are based on her experiences working at the Pentagon and also as a diplomat for the State Department handling Holocaust issues in Poland. She lives outside Philadelphia with her husband and 3 children, where in addition to writing, she teaches law school. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Pam.
Thanks so much for having me.
And when does she sleep? That's what I want to know.
Yeah, really. And just, going over your bio, is George Washington University, is that the one in St. Louis?
No, that's Washington University. Washington. I went to GW, which is in Washington, D.C.
Okay, right. Yeah. And Cambridge is in England?
Yes.
Yes.
Cambridge in England.
Have you always been fascinated by history?
I have. I certainly enjoyed historical books when I was a child, and I think that, thinking about the books with which we introduce history to our children is just so very interesting to me, especially now as I have children myself. But I was always interested, and throughout school, and read history at Cambridge and so on.
And the book that we're talking about today is The Orphan's Tale, which is a novel set in World War II. In Germany and France and that area. Before we get into that, just a couple more questions about your background. Where outside Philadelphia are you?
I'm really in New Jersey.
Ah, okay.
Southern part of New Jersey, so we say Philadelphia for ease of reference. So my office sort of looks across the Philadelphia.
I grew up in Lancaster, so the other side of Philadelphia.
My husband is from Lancaster. I'm very familiar with it.
Oh, very good. Very good. And what made you decide to start, first of all, are all of your novels historical novels?
I've written 1 or 2 modern, and at least was a hybrid going back and forth, past and present, but I would say they're predominantly historical fiction, mostly set in the first half of the 20th century, and the nucleus of that for me would be the Second World War.
And what is it about that time period that draws your interest over and over again?
Well, for me personally, my interest in the era comes from the years I spent in Europe as a diplomat for the State Department. So I was sent to Poland about 20 years ago as a junior diplomat, and I found myself in that part of the world at a fascinating moment in time, because the countries in Central and Eastern Europe had just come out of those decades of communism, and all through the years where they had no free speech, they were unable to resolve many issues from World War II about anti-Semitism and property and how to preserve the concentration camps. And when I arrived in Poland, I was this young girl in my early 20s and was I was alone over there. So I had become very close to the Holocaust survivors in Krakow. And the U.S. government, seeing my relationship with those people, gave me responsibility for all the issues related to World War II, and that became my job.
Wow.
I was profoundly moved and changed by those experiences, and I knew that I wanted to write about them, and I've sort of been doing so in some form ever since.
There can't be all that many survivors left living now.
No, I think that's right. And, when you ask me the question of what draws me to the era, I can answer that on one level. But I think there's a bigger question of what draws so many of us to the era, particularly in literature. And so, for example, when I talk about communism ending, all sorts of archival resources became available to us as writers after that period. And I think that is spurning a lot of interest in the era. But also, as to the survivors, as they get up there in years, there's a real impetus to capture and tell their stories in memoir and fiction and many different forms.
That is a very good point. And we have seen a number of those. We've actually interviewed a number of survivors who've written books. One was The Boy on the Wooden Box. Actually, we interviewed his son because the author passed away right after the book was written, but before it was published. And
he was one of the guy Schindler. He was one of Schindler's List persons.
Yeah. And then let's see, Someday There Will Be Sun was another memoir that we interviewed recently. So tell us a little bit about the story of the Orphan's Tale and where the inspiration for this story came from.
So the Orphan's Tale is a little bit different, although it comes from my love for the era. The story did not come from my own personal experiences, but from two true stories that I found while I was researching. I was looking around in the virtual archives of Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Museum in Israel, and they have a database of righteous people who were known to have helped during the war. And the first story I found, it's a really horrific tale, and it has to do with what was known as the train of unknown infants. And this was a train of babies who were on their own and taken from their parents, too young to know their own names, and that train was headed for the concentration camps. And so I borrowed that horrific image. The second story I found was a remarkable account of something they called the Rescuers Circus, and it was a German circus that had sheltered Jews during the war. And although I've been working with the war for 2 decades, I'd never heard of such a thing. And so I was incredibly inspired by both stories, and I wove them together to create my book.
Wow!
And you wove them together very, very expertly, I must say.
Wow! How did you research what it would have been like in a circus, a traveling circus at that time in history?
Well, it's interesting. So I had these two ideas, and I started to research the circus piece of it. And immediately, I found this fascinating book. I sort of stumbled upon it. I teach at a university. I teach law school at Rutgers, and we have a wonderful library. So I was sort of in the library there. And I found a book, and it was actually about Jewish figures in German culture from the 1850s through World War II, which is an academic text. But one entire section of that book focused on circuses. And one thing I was amazed to find in my research was that there were Jewish circus dynasties which had persisted in Europe for centuries. And I mean, some of them with 12 and 13 children and multiple traveling circuses. And it was this fascinating history. They were all gone by the end of the war. Now, of course, my book is not about a Jewish circus family. It's about a German circus that sheltered Jews. But I was so inspired, the historian in me really wanted to use this material.
Oh, absolutely.
But actually,
one of my main characters became Astrid, and she's a Jewish woman who her own circus family is gone, and she's in hiding with the German circus.
Well, the circus performers are all kind of a family, though, as they travel and perform. They become kind of a family, don't they?
Yes, and one of the most fascinating quotes from the real circus owner who rescued Jews, he said, among circus folk we see no difference as to race and religion. And when you consider how society was so divided and so dangerous at that point in time, it's interesting that the circus was kind of this haven for eclectic individuals.
Yes.
Wow. It's it feels like that you really captured the feel of the circus, and there has to have been more than just this one book talking about the dynasties. I mean, just how the trapeze works and how the tent goes up. And how did you discover all of that?
Oh, it was a long process, and I didn't give that all in my earlier answer because I know I tend to go on. But it was interesting on many levels. First, when I contemplated the circus, I was like, I hesitated because I said, I don't love the circus, and when you're going to write a book, you really spend a year with that material at least. And so I hesitated, although, and I'll get to the research in a second, I promise, what I came to find was that these were not just circus stories. These were really human stories, of love and redemption and finding home. But specifically with respect to the circus, it was a real mixture of sources. Of course, the first thing I needed to know a lot about how a circus works. And one piece of that, you have to be really careful because American circuses and European circuses were just completely different. So their circuses were always one ring, as opposed to this three-ring notion. And the terminology of a European circus is different, and the animals are perhaps less prominent. So getting the feel of a European circus, I had books, and there are websites dedicated to circus arts, and I learned many interesting things about how the ring is deliberately staged, and yes, how they raise the mast, how they raise the whole tent at once, and about the sequence in which they stage the act very deliberately, to bring them in. And those sorts of things, the historian wants to do a big dump of information, and the writer sort of has to space it out a little bit. So that was fascinating. And then once I got past the circus big picture, I had to look at aerial arts and the flying trapeze. And for that, I had an aerialist on retainer. By on retainer, I mean she was helping me for free. She was great, but it wasn't until I was almost done writing the book that I knew the questions I wanted to ask her. Sort of how many people would you need for this type of act, and if you threw the person here, could they get back, up to the platform, and all those sorts of questions I asked her. And she also, I did not go on the flying trapeze. I've sometimes been asked that, but she sent me explain.
Why didn't you go?
Well, I'm not very brave in general, but and I really had a question. As I said, I'm not a big fan of the circus. I was like, do I need to go to the circus for this research? But I found that going to an American circus, I really think would have clouded things for me. So I relied a lot on secondary sources for the Europeans.
Are there still these traveling European circuses? Are they still
I would not think so as much. Here's the interesting parallel. When you look at the European circuses, that even before World War II, they were sort of dying off. The Depression and World War I had taken their toll, and then people were finding other forms of popular entertainment, like the movies. So by the time you get to World War II, the circus is already weakened, and it takes that blow. Now, there are certainly still circuses in Europe, and some of those old families have continued in some form. I just don't know how prevalent they are, but there seems to me to be a parallel to today. I'm sure you've heard that Ringling Brothers, the great American icon, recently did its last shows.
I know.
Again, I think it was weakened, and other forms of entertainment have taken over.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But there is nothing like for kids.
I know.
The circus is exciting.
I know.
Yes, and I read when people were posting about Ringling Brothers, and there was an equal sense of people who were glad to see it go because of cruelty to animals and whatnot, and a sense of nostalgia for people. My kids have never seen a circus. I don't know if they will.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good point. Now, you did live in Europe for a number of years. How important is that in terms of the settings and just sort of the logistical aspects of your books?
So I spent almost 5 years in Europe, equal parts between England and Poland, and that doesn't count, of course, all the times I travel over there and that sort of thing. So my books have had a lot of, sort of a heavier focus on Europe. What I always say is that real life makes for a terrible plot, but it makes for a wonderful setting. So if I can take all of these things that I've felt and seen over there and kind of weave them into the sense of place, that's really where I'm trying to go with the material. This book was much harder for me. My comfort zone is like east of Germany, Poland, that, Czech Republic, that sort of thing. And this book was France, Germany and France, because the circuit starts in its winter quarters in Germany and then goes on the road to France. So it was a different type of place for me to research.
And certainly a good excuse to travel to France?
Well, it's a good excuse. I know writers who I love dearly who take 3 and 4 trips to Europe for research for every book, and God bless them. I have 3 small kids and a day job, and honestly, when you're writing historical fiction, the biggest utility of travel is probably seeing the physical layout, So if I'm writing something set in London, which I often do, I want to walk Fleet Street, and I want to know the exact point where it breaks and St. Paul's comes into view. But in terms of actual research, there's so much that's online right now that, depending what you're looking for, it may be negligible.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could probably even do what you're talking about, Fleet Street, on Google Maps.
Exactly.
Or Google Earth.
Although I'll take
Google
a trip
Earth.
to England.
Yeah. Particularly if it's tax deductible.
Exactly.
Now, your books, your previous books have been, or at least one of them was an international bestseller. I'm sure they've all done well. And most people think that, if you're a best-selling author, you don't need a day job. So what keeps you still doing teaching law?
Well, let me clarify the first part of that, which is, so my first book, Commandant's Girl, was an international bestseller, and some of my books have done well, but I've certainly weathered the highs and lows of publishing, like so many of us have, and I've been joking this week that I'm an overnight success 10 years in the making, because on March 1st, this March 1st, we just found out that The Orphan's Tale hit the New York Times bestseller list. It's certainly my first book to do so, and it happened exactly 10 years to the day after Commandant's Girl came out. So it has been a perfect 10-year full circle to get to this point.
Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
That is very good news.
Yes, it was completely unexpected. But so with respect to the day job, let me say a few things. There's only 3 things I do in my schedule. I raise my children, I write, and I teach. And I love all 3 of those things. So if I hit Powerball tomorrow, I would still do all 3. I might just slow down a bit. I really do love it. Teaching is a great thing, and it's a wonderful synergy with writing, because writing is such a solitary business. And I get to be with people and talk. It's very challenging to balance the time. I sometimes say that being a part-time writer is like fighting with one hand tied behind your back. But for me, it's worth the stretch, and it has helped me to weather the highs and lows of the publishing business. And I consider myself very lucky to have a quote unquote day job that allows such synergy with my writing.
Wow! Now, who's your publisher?
I am published by Mira Books, which is, I guess, part of Harlequin, which is part of HarperCollins.
Okay.
So it's sort of hard to keep track of.
I know, isn't it? Aren't they all, in the end, part of one or two?
Yes, and I'm going to be part of, there's a new imprint they've just started called Park Row, and so my next book will be with them. So, but I'm very happy. Mira published my first book 10 years ago, my first 2 books, and I did sort of around the world of publishing, and while I'm grateful to all of the other publishers I've been with, I have to say my publishing team right now is largely the same folks I started with a decade ago. So I have all the benefit of this family feel at my publisher, and I enjoy, the phenomenal reach of HarperCollins sales force. So I'm very, very grateful.
Well, congratulations. You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Pam Jenoff, author of The Orphan's Tale, which is a novel set during World War II in Germany and France. Sometimes when we look back and it's hard to believe that the things that happened back then could have happened. How did people allow, because, I believe most people are good. or have goodness in them. And one thing that I really found interesting about your book was the character of the mayor, who really doesn't appear in the book except through his son, but you're sort of explaining maybe why he was cooperating with the Nazis, and it's not because he was a bad person.
Well, it's interesting, as I said, I spent those years living in Eastern Europe and working closely on Holocaust issues. And one thing that came out of my experience there is I grew up in the States with a certain view of the war that was more black and white. And when I was in Poland, I found many shades of gray and many nuances in the history and individualized human responses to different situations. And this has left an impression on me. And so my books, I strive to show those gray areas, that my German characters are human and my Jewish characters are flawed and my ordinary citizens fall everywhere in between. And so I put the mayor in that, everywhere in between category. Looking at how people responded to the war, there was a range of responses. And oftentimes I ask myself, and I hope my readers will ask themselves, what would I have done in, those circumstances? Because I don't know what I would have done during the war. I don't think I would have helped the Germans, but as I have said, I'm not a very brave individual. I might have hidden in my basement, so it's just an interesting question about individual response.
Well, I think too, I think you touched on it in here that people thought when their neighbors were taken away that they were resettling them somewhere. They didn't know for some time that it was going to be concentration camps. I mean, that was the first thing.
Right. And also in some of the books that I talked about the guests we've had before, it became really clear to me that part of how it happened was that the Nazis didn't start all of a sudden, let's round everybody up.
No.
It started with things that seemed not that bad.
Yeah.
And then people would get used to that, and then they'd layer on something else that wasn't that. It's not that bad, and so people weren't the other people who weren't being subjected to these minor cruelties became accustomed to them because they weren't so bad that they would just rise up and say, "No, you can't do this." To our neighbors, it's like, oh well, that's not that big a deal, and then by the time it got to where it really was that bad, they were inured to it. They had learned to, they had accepted the idea by then that their Jewish neighbors or gypsies or whomever were a subclass and weren't entitled to.
And also, I think at a certain point they were afraid themselves because they never knew when the next person was going to be taken. I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
Is it hard for you, Pam, to, when you're writing, you kind of have to immerse yourself into that environment emotionally?
It is. And so before I answer that, I just wanted to say, I do think there's a question about who knew what when during the war as I researched. So first of all, there are places, frankly, where people were looking over their fence into a concentration camp. Like not there are places that it's really hard to look away from, and perhaps other places that were more shielded. When I researched this book, I was shocked by the brutality in France. I never fully focused, you think, oh, Paris. I never fully focused on how bad it was in France for the Jews and the other people that were taken. And one thing that was going on there is not just the incremental worsening of treatment, but the incremental persecution of groups. So, for example, first they were persecuting the immigrant Jews, the ones who were not lawfully in France, and the native Jewish community said, oh, well, that's not me. And then, they thought it would never be them. So it got worse, like the dragnet got bigger as they went. And I just thought that was very interesting in my research. As to me and immersing, yes, you would think after all of these books I might somehow be used to it, but if anything, it's gotten harder and worse. So I refer to The Orphan's Tale as the book that it broke me to write, because And it really comes down to that scene of the train of unknown children.
Oh,
I found that immediately.
Yeah.
I knew it was going to figure early and prominently in my book, and I waited forever to write that scene because I knew that in order to do so, I would have to metaphorically put my own children on that train, which was something I was not prepared to do, emotionally. And I did it. And, it was hard to write anything after that. So, yes, it's very difficult. I think more so now as a mother to deal with this material than ever before.
I just don't understand how anybody could see that and just turn away.
I know. Well, Noah, in the book, the girl, she wanted to save all of them, of course. And, and that the decision she had to make was that she took the one baby boy. But when just the idea of opening that door and seeing that, I can understand how it was very difficult for you as a writer to keep that in there.
How did they even know about that? How, historically, how was that documented?
Well, this was an account, and I should say that in terms of real history, because I always want to be very accurate about what I've done. My book's a complete fictionalization of history, but the story that I read that inspired it was a personal testimony in this archive where it was a family, and I don't want to get this wrong because I don't have it in front of me. It was a Dutch family that had rescued a baby or who had been hiding a baby, and they were found out, and that child was taken and put on this train. So in the story, it was no more than a reference of this train that was headed for the camp with the babies. And the visualization of that is all mine, in my creative license. But I think what makes Noah so interesting in her finding the babies, and I just want to back up, for people who haven't read it, and say Noah is 16. She's a young Dutch girl. She's not Jewish, and she's been kicked out by her own parents after she became pregnant by a German soldier, and she's forced at this home for unwed mothers to give up her baby. So when she finds this train car of babies, she's living alone above a German rail station. She's been forced to give up her child, and she's cleaning the rail station to earn her keep. So she's in a really scary, lonely place for a 16-year-old. And as hard as it is for me to imagine this train, I'm trying to imagine the horror of this 16-year-old girl who has already had her own child ripped from her arms and then finds a train car full of babies. Yeah. That emotional overlay.
Yeah.
Wow. You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. Our guest today is Pam Jenoff, author of The Orphan's Tale. Pam, why don't you read a section from the book for us today? I will,
and I thought about what I was going to read, and there was a time when I was going to read about the train of children, but given how much we've spoken about it and how heavy that is, I think I'm going to go in a different direction.
Okay, that's good.
I would like to read the prologue of the book to you, and I just want to say before I open that although the entire book is set during the war, the prologue and the epilogue are in the present day. So we are looking at, so this is a present-day prologue, and it says it's set in Paris. They will be looking for me by now. I pause on the granite steps of the museum, reaching for the railing to steady myself. Pain sharper than ever creaks through my left hip, not perfectly healed from last year's break. Across the avenue Winston Churchill, behind the glass dome of the Grand Palace, the March sky is rosy at dusk. I peer around the edge of the arched entranceway of the Petit Palace. From the massive stone column hangs a red banner 2 stories high, 200 years of circus magic. It is festooned with elephants, a tiger, and a clown, their colors so much brighter in my memories. I should have told someone I was going. They would have only tried to stop me, though. My escape, months in the planning since I'd read about the upcoming exhibit in the Times, had been well orchestrated. I had bribed an aide at the nursing home to take the photo I needed to mail to the passport office, paid for the plane ticket in cash. I had almost been caught when the taxi cab I called pulled up in front of the home in the pre-dawn darkness and honked loudly, but the guard at the desk remained asleep. Summoning my strength now, I begin to climb again, taking each painful step one by one. Inside the lobby, the opening gala is already in full swing. Clusters of men in tuxedos and women in evening gowns mingling beneath the elaborately painted dome ceiling. Conversations in French bubble around me like a long-forgotten perfume I'm desperate to inhale. Familiar words trickle back, first in a stream, then a river, though I've scarcely heard them in half a century. I do not stop at the reception desk to check in. They are not expecting me. Instead, dodging the butler hors d'oeuvres and champagne, I make my way along the mosaic floors, past a wall of murals to the circus exhibit, its entrance marked by a smaller version of the banner outside. There are photos blown up and hung from the ceiling by wire too fine to see, images of a sword swallower and dancing horses and still more clowns. From the labels below each picture, the names come back to me like a song: Lurch, Dionier, Neuhoff, great European circus dynasties felled by war and time. At the last of these names, my eyes begin to burn. Beyond the photos hangs a tall, worn placard of a woman suspended from silk ropes by her arms, one leg extended behind her in mid-air arabesque. Her youthful face and body are barely recognizable to me. In my mind, the song of the carousel begins to play, tinny and faint like a music box. I feel the searing heat of the light, so hot it could almost peel off my skin. A flying trapeze hangs above the exhibit, fixed as if in mid-flight. Even now, my almost 90-year-old legs ache with yearning to climb up there. But there's no time for memories. Getting here took longer than I thought, like everything else these days, and there isn't a minute to spare. Pushing down the lump in my throat, I press forward, past the costumes and headdresses, artifacts of a lost civilization. Finally, I reach the rail car. Some of the side panels have been removed to reveal the close, tiny berths inside. I'm struck by the compact size, less than half my shared room at the nursing home. It had seemed so much larger in my mind. Had we really lived in there for months on end? I reach out my hand to touch the rotting wood. Though I had known the rail car was the same the minute I had seen it in the paper, some piece of my heart had been too afraid to believe it until now. Voices grow louder behind me. I glance quickly over my shoulder. The reception is breaking up and the attendees drawing closer to the exhibit. In a few more minutes, it will be too late. I look back once more, then crouch to slip beneath the rope stanchion. Hide, a voice seems to say, the long-buried instinct rising up in me once more. Instead, I run my hand under the bottom of the rail car. The compartment is there exactly as I remembered. The door still sticks, but if I press it on it just so. It snaps open, and I imagine the rush of excitement of a young girl looking for a scribbled invitation to a secret rendezvous. But as I reach inside, my fingers close around cold, dark space. The compartment is empty, and the dream that I had that it might hold the answers evaporates like cool mist.
And that was Pam Jenoff reading from the prologue of The Orphan's Tale, which is a beautiful story of love and redemption.
And it is.
Pam, when you're writing, do you know, you had these two stories that you were wanting to weave together. Do you decide the whole plot before you start writing, or does it come from the writing?
So it's interesting. I only learned in recent years of my writing that there are two camps of writers. There are the plotters and the pantsers. I don't know if you've heard this before on your show, but there are these writers who are wonderful linear writers. They go sentence to sentence until the book is done, and they have outlines and all sorts of charts. That's not me. I am what's called a pantser, which stands for seat of the pants. So what I do is I turn on a computer or open a computer, and I have an image in my mind, and I go blah, which is I throw down 60,000 of the worst possible words in any order they come out. It's just pure junk, and someone once described that as throwing up on the page. I apologize for that description. But literally, I just let it all come out at once for like months and months on end. And then at some point, this document becomes unwieldy. I can't do it anymore. And that's when I start with chapters and outlines. But it's very latent for me that I get to that point in my process. So typically, I have an opening image, and I have some idea where it's going to wind up. Although this book, I don't want to ruin anything, but this book, there were surprises for me toward the end. But I have some idea of the ending, where it's going to wind up. And it's that big, dark middle that takes all that time. And so this is my 9th book, and I know at some point the clouds are going to clear and the sun will shine through and the whole book will come together, although that can be a really late moment depending on what year it is. But the thing is, the other thing that helps is certain times when I'm writing books, there are certain things that I call high moments, a couple scenes in the middle that I can see along the way like beacons, and those can be really helpful in sustaining me. But I don't map it all out ahead of time.
Do you write it kind of chronologically?
I don't.
You don't.
I let everything come out at once, and then I fix it up chronologically. It'd be great. I'd aspire to do that because the way I do it, the editing is awful. Everything around. But I just throw it all out there, and then I figure it out afterward.
Wow. And how do you... So you get it all out there, and you must, when you're rearranging, you must then find, I need more of this. This doesn't really fit. Do you do that? Do you have any visual representation of that? Do you do a flow chart or anything at that point?
Well, I do have a notebook, and there's lots of different ways I problem solve or put things on arcs or, try and describe the whole book in 10 scenes or those sorts of things. Just I don't have a system, I just read that there's another Pantser author who does some sort of mind mapping on a computer. I don't really, or some people are big Post-it note people.
Right.
I just have a notebook. And I just work through stuff a lot until it works. What is uniquely challenging with this book was the two voices. So this book is written from the alternating points of view of Noah, who's the young 16-year-old who rescues the baby, and Astrid, who is an aerialist who's closer to 40. So writing this was challenging because, one, I want to get their voices right and distinct. And secondly, my natural instinct towards symmetry would be every other chapter, Noah Astrid, and at some point that just wasn't possible because I needed, sometimes one of their stories needed more room to unfurl.
I was going to ask about that as you're in the big get it all down on the page process. Are you alternating between Noah and Astrid in that process too?
At that point, I'm not even thinking about whose voice it is. There's just all this stuff in my head that, be it dialogue or description or inner narrative, whatever's going on, and I just let it all come out. And oftentimes, it's not till after that I realize that, yes, this would be Noah or this would be, unless it's an overt dialogue between the two of them, when it's clear they're both there. Oftentimes, not till later do I realize who's speaking, which makes it sort of complicated to get the voice right.
That is true. Have your other books been in the dual point of view also?
I have written books from multiple points of view. I had one book that followed an object through different points in time, and so that book had a lot of different narrators. I've done other books exclusively from a first-person point of view. I did do one book between twin sisters, now that I'm thinking about it, that went back and forth. But this was trickier. Both, I'd say, because their voices were so different and their experiences were so different.
And they're both written in first person, both points of view.
Yes, and I think the other time I alternated might have been third person alternating.
How do you decide between those two, between writing in first and in third?
It's the funniest thing. It's also the question of between past and present, but I'll take your question first. That I almost always start writing a book in the third person. And at some point, at some awful moment, I realize that it should be in the first person a lot of the time. And it's akin to when you meet someone and you call them Mr. or Mrs., and later you call them by their first name. And maybe I just don't know them well enough when I start out. So oftentimes I start in the third person, and then I change it all over to first person.
Which is not that easy to do, to go back and change it all.
The other dilemma, right, is the past versus present tense. I was once, when I was working on my very first book, Commandant's Girl, I had written that book all in the past tense, and I was literally sitting on the beach next to a friend, and I looked over at what she was reading, and it was in first person present. And I was like, shoot, I need to change this over. But it just really depends on the book and the tone and, what I like to write, and sometimes what I like to read could be different, by the way.
Now, you mentioned that Commandant Girl came out 10 years ago. How long had you been writing before that?
Well, it's an interesting story. So I was a little kid who always wanted to be a writer. I was one of those, always scribbling, and I always thought it was going to be books, and never short stories or poems. And for many years, through Europe and school, when I had so much time to write, really, I never got off the ground with that novel. I could never really get it going. For me, what actually happened was, believe it or not, 9/11. So I came back from being a diplomat. I went to law school at Penn in Philadelphia, became a practicing attorney on September 4th, 2001. I started practicing, and that was exactly 1 week to the day before 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, I had this life epiphany where I said, being a lawyer is fine and great profession, but I've always wanted to be a writer, and if I had been a 9/11 victim, I never would have realized my dream. So it was really that moment in time that kind of got me in gear to writing. I took a night course, and I started writing Commandant's Girl. Now, there were two catches to the story. One is that although I was now serious about being a writer, I also had a day job at a large law firm, and I had to repay $1,000 a month in student loan debt for law school. So I used to write my novels from 5 to 7 in the morning before I went to the firm, because I couldn't just go sit in a castle and write.
You're right, exactly.
So I had to make it coexist with my day job even then. The other thing was that it was not a short road to publication for me, because once I finished writing Commandant's Girl, it was 5 years and 39 publisher rejections until one publisher we didn't even know was still reading it made a tiny offer 11 months later for Commandant's Girl. And of course now things have gone well and all that, but I still have rejection letters from everybody from back in the day.
Now, were you using an agent?
I was using an agent. I had an agent at that point, as I do now.
And how was it to find the agent? Because I've often heard that it's harder to get an agent than it is once you have an agent to get a publisher.
I think both steps are hard. It's certainly hard to get an agent because, they're only taking on what they think they can sell. And so back then it wasn't email, it was still snail mail, where I sent out, 100 queries to agents, and, some subset of those wanted to see the manuscript, and we went from there. But even after you have an agent, there's no guarantees they're going to sell it. So the funny part was, the day my phone rang, I still remember the exact date, but the day my phone rang, and it was a Friday afternoon, just like today, and my agent's number popped up on caller ID. When I picked up the phone, I said to him, "Are you calling to fire me?" Because I hadn't made this poor guy a dime at that point, before he sold my book. And he was, in fact, calling to tell me he had sold my book.
Oh. And are you still with that same agent?
I'm not. I switched maybe 2.5 years ago. I'm still very good friends with that agent. I joke that we're like better off, divorced than married, but we're very good friends. But he was doing other types of projects, I felt like, more so, and so I'm, with someone who's a little more focused on my type of work.
Well, what kind of advice would you give someone who is writing, who writes historical novels, and wants to be published? Where would you tell someone today to start?
Well, it's interesting. I don't have as good a knowledge of the market from the get an agent standpoint. So my general advice to people who want to write, I would say, first of all, is there's 3 things. You have to be really disciplined about your writing, because even today nobody says, "Hey, Pam, go take some writing time." You really have to carve that time out for yourself. You have to be really tenacious, because I know a lot of writers who are actually much better than me but are not published because they didn't persist in trying, through the rejections. And I think it's also really important to be able to revise, because if you're not able to take the feedback you get from an agent or, a peer group, a writing group, and make your work better, it's hard to do it. So that's sort of my general advice. With respect to specifically getting in the door, you get your work in as good a shape as you possibly can before submitting it. On my first book, I worked with a private editor to make my writing better. You do that before you submit. And oftentimes you can start with a more junior agent because they may be more open to queries. And, of course, as you probably know, my last piece of advice is always don't quit your day job process.
And you've been taking that advice all along.
I'm very serious about it, yeah.
Now, excuse me. Let's go back a little more to your writing process in the editing process. How long does that take for you?
Well, the writing and the editing process, I think it varies with every single book. So I used to say ballpark a year with all my other commitments to do a book. That really can vary for me, depending. There's been times when they really, really needed a book, and I just crushed it out. I think I'm slower now. Honestly, as I get older and the books get harder, I'm not always running to my office at 5 a.m. on Sundays. And so, and I also am not as much of a fan of, I'm sort of wondering if my editor's listening, but I'm not as much of a fan these days of, publishing a book every 11 or 12 months. I would rather, I like the 12 to 18 months, because, it has taken so much energy to support Orphan's Tale, and so many people have put time and support into it that I don't want to fatigue everybody, including myself.
And you would have
slow down a bit.
You would have finished writing Orphan's Tale a year and a half ago? Does it take that long to get out, or a year ago?
Really interesting, because it varies on when you finish a book and how quickly they want to get it out. So we had a nice long lead time on Orphan's Tale, and it was partly scheduling and partly intentional. So I feel like I would have turned in a draft around Labor Day a year and a half ago, and then gone through editing. So it's probably been fully complete for about 14, 15 months, something like that. But I would far rather have too much time than rush a book and not get the galleys to the reviewers, to build the buzz.
Right. When you're doing your editing after, it sounds like you do one complete draft, and then you start working on it. Do you have second, third, fourth drafts, or is it you have the first draft and then all these changes and then to a final, like your second draft is your final draft?
It's really hard for me to quantify when I finish one draft and begin another. So if I start a book with that big pile of blah I told you about, and then I make it look better, and then I go over and I make it better and better, and just keep knitting and fine-tuning the words over and over again, and at some point I print it out and I start reading it, and this is all my year or my whatever I'm taking on a particular book, and you have to build in the research at the beginning of that year, the research time. So at some point, I don't really have any beta readers at this point. I used to be in a writer's workshop, but I don't have one right now. So there's actually nobody reading the manuscript for me at this point. It's all me. And then when I feel
not even a family member.
What's that?
Not even a family member.
My mom is one of the first reads when I have a finished copy, but not during. If I have questions or doubts, I would call my editor and talk through them, but not actually showing. Because my process isn't linear, it's not like I can hand her sample chapters. It's all comes together at once. So what happens is, though, I submit it to my editor, I bite my nails for weeks, and then she comes back with that first revision letter. And the revision letter is long and daunting. I have a great, very rigorous editor. And editors, they don't give you solutions. They just give you problems. So they tell you what's wrong with the book, and then you go back and try and fix it. You can talk it through with them, but you find the solution that works for you. And the changes go from big changes in that first round of revision she gives me, maybe through 2 or 3 or more rounds where the changes get progressively more granular into the minutia, go from biggest to smallest. And then at some point when we're happy, it would go into production after all those rounds of back and forth.
How do you know when it's ready to send to the editor?
At that point, I'm happy with the story. I'm happy with the structure. I think I've really got. I've read it. I've printed it out. It looked. I'm not one of these people. By the way, I know writers that they hand in a manuscript and their editor says, "Yeah, that's beautiful. You're done." That's not me. I actually know that I need a lot of editing help. And I believe that one of the biggest keys to success as a writer is knowing your own writing style and proclivity. So, for example, I tend to be on the brief side, and I need someone to tell me where to flesh it out. You know what I mean? So that's the kind of feedback that often comes back to me. And sometimes when I'm writing it, I know it's not perfect, but I don't know what else it needs. It's a bit like a recipe. Does it need more salt? I just don't know. And at that point, when I'm ready to have my editor sort of taste the recipe, she can tell me what it is.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and our guest today is Pam Jenoff, author of The Orphan's Tale.
These two main characters, the two women, they each have a deep secret, and the one is a star, of course. She's the aerialist, and the other one is learning to be. And I can't imagine how hard that is to learn to be an aerialist. I mean, to fly through the air.
I certainly can't imagine, since I was unwilling to get on a trapeze for this. After Noah snatches the baby and she finds shelter with the circus owner says, we're happy to have you stay, but in order to blend in, you're going to have to become part of the circus, if you will. And, and he decides that she looks right for the flying trapeze. Now, Astrid, the older woman, who's this Jewish woman hiding with the circus, she's a seasoned aerialist, and she is tasked with teaching Noah the flying trapeze. And Astrid is none too happy with this. First of all, she doesn't think Noah can do it. This is actually 16's really late to be learning the trapeze. And second, she doesn't like the unwanted attention that Noah has brought to the circus while she's been trying to lie low. And finally, she doesn't believe necessarily the whole story Noah's telling about her past, because Noah has not revealed everything to the circus. So this book is really about the friendship between the two women, and whether they can save each other or whether their secrets will destroy them both.
Because she says that the baby is her brother. And
yes, she doesn't say that she snatched the baby. She says that the baby is her little brother.
Yeah, but it is beautifully written, and you get into the depth of each character's feelings and how they perceive what's going on, because it's a confusing time. Golly,
Is it realistic for someone to learn the trapeze at that age? I mean, she did have some advantages. She'd been a gymnast, and she was, athletic. But do you think that's really possible?
I certainly think it's possible. I mean, look, in these days, people go and try new things and, try the trapeze and all of that. So, but I did think, there's a lot in a book is, there's some facts, right, that and then there's some spaces where you have to think about what's possible and what is believable. And so the things that would make this possible are, number one, that she had this background in gymnastics, and that was very conscious on my part, that she had some skill, some physical prowess, right, that was going to make this possible. Secondly, that Astrid was so strong because, as the book notes, much of the work is actually done by the catcher, the person who is throwing the other person, right? Yeah. So if the catchers can position themselves, not as hard for the actual flyer to complete the routine. And the third part was I very consciously kept the moves that Noah did pretty basic. So when I'm looking through a glossary of what is possible on the flying trapeze, I'm not trying to give Noah the most sophisticated moves. I'm trying to give her the bare minimum that she would be able to execute and be part of the act.
Well, it was believable.
Oh, it was.
I think. Yeah.
Because of course she had to hide from the authorities too.
And they both had their secrets. And the other place where I had to conjecture a bit, and I should just share this, is I knew that the circus was permitted to continue during the war. And I knew that because there were these accounts from the real story about the Jewish person hiding as part of the act. So I knew it was going on. But what was not documented was the wheres and hows of how the circus performed during the war. That was virtually impossible to find. So I had to take a hard look at the war and think about where and how a circus might have been allowed to persist. And so some of that is speculative as to where they went.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
it's not like there's anyone who's likely to correct you on that.
You would be surprised. People love to correct writers.
Oh, really?
Wikipedia everyone loves to go on Wikipedia and say aha, and they like to do it very publicly. But so far, the response has been overwhelmingly positive, and I really have not seen that.
Well, that's wonderful.
Well, we highly recommend this book. It's one you really can't put it down. I mean, you can't.
I'm a big fan of historical fiction.
I am too.
It's probably one of my favorite things to read.
Yeah.
And this is a book that you get totally absorbed in, and just want to see how it ends. Was there ever an exhibit on circus arts in Paris like you had in the prologue?
That I fictionalized.
Okay.
That was me. I needed that hook because the woman at the beginning of the book, from the excerpt I read you don't know who she is and you don't know what she's looking for, and it's not till the end of the book that you find out.
Right. That's why you can't put it down. And we're not going to spoil it by telling you the end. So there.
Now, one last question. I'm curious. How do your children? What do they think about your writing? And are any of them old enough to read your books?
Well, my children are little. My children are 8 and under, so
Okay.
they definitely are not reading this. But they have a keen awareness. They were just at my book launch, and they have a keen awareness of what I do. And my favorite story is that we were at a park, and I saw my son talking to some older woman, and I thought, why is he talking to a stranger? And as I walked up, I heard him say to her, "Have you read any books by Pam Jenoff?"
Oh, my gosh, really?
Wonderful.
He's my son in this story. And the woman said, "Well, what has she written?" And he proceeded to rattle off my entire backlist.
Oh, wow.
So they are very helpful and very interested.
Well, Pam, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm guessing there'll be another book coming out in a year or so?
Yes, I'm still in the dark writing part of that, but we'll get there.
Okay, all right. And, Mom, do you have some closing words of wisdom for us?
This just fits so perfectly. This is a quote from a woman named Rachel Maddow. If you are someone people can count on, particularly in difficult moments, that's a sign of a life lived honorably. And that's what these 2 women did.
Well, Pam, thank you for bringing this story and shining some light on these forgotten areas of Holocaust history.
Thanks so much for having me.
And see you next week on Writers' Voices.